So, welcome to the second Endurance Podcast. Today, we're going to move on a little bit and talk about racing at various levels, really, sort of from World Tour downwards. So, we're recording this on the rest day of the Giro. It's in full swing, and we've seen quite a few different style of stages. So, we've had some long, fast days, some short, really intense stage with lots of climbing in, and some much easier, well, for some people, much easier days as well as some quite interesting environmental factors to take into consideration. So some hot days and some much cooler days at the start. So yeah, Tim's been providing some nutritional support to some of the guys on the Giro. So I guess how do you prepare for the different stages, and especially sort of not really knowing what's going to come up day by day?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and this is like a big challenge for like the whole team, basically, because you can't really know what's going to happen. Because on paper, a certain stage can be super easy. Like, for instance, let's just like take one flat stage. This means that on the paper it looks easy, but for instance, the winds can come, crosswinds can make a big difference, and yeah, sometimes you can basically lose a race on a such day that's supposed to be easy. On the other day, it can be like you see big mountains. For instance, yesterday, yeah, it was Sunday. The stage was very hilly, but nothing really happened. Everyone was staying together, at least the main GC guys, and it wasn't as hard as it could have been. So you can't really know what's going to happen on each stage. And I think there are like best differences between easy and very hard stages. Because like in the first week, I think when there was some like data out there published on the cycling websites, that's on one stage, I think the heart rate for some of the riders was like on average 110 and after like 130. So it was super easy from start to finish. And on those days, you can't really like the energy turnover, energy expenditure, let's call it, is super small. So you can easily overeat. And one of the biggest struggles actually on like Giro d'Italia or 3-week long race is not to put on weight. And it's very difficult to kind of understand for those that like just watch the telly and just like probably watch the last like half an hour, 1 hour. And they feel like, well, yeah, they've been cycling for the whole day, but it's actually very easy, or it can be very easy. And this is like very difficult to then kind of predict what's going to happen. And you have to be ready for each and every stage and kind of be ready what's going to, if something goes wrong, if you crash, for instance, you have to come back, you catch the first group, the peloton. This can be super hard. So it's very, very like difficult to manipulate the availability of the food so that you basically don't overfuel the riders. But also like you have to make sure that you fuel them enough for really hard days. So it's very tricky if you're a nutritionist on working for a world tour cycling team.
I guess the crash is a really good example actually of how things can go completely wrong. It reminded me of a long time ago now. I did the Etapta tour with a friend of mine from Oxford, and he was quite a clever guy. He was a medical doctor, but he had it wasn't a crash actually, but it was a problem with one of his wheels on one of the first descents, and he had to stop and wait ages. And eventually, they had like Mavic neutral service, same as the tour at the time. So they gave him a spare wheel, but then he was like super motivated to try and make up the lost time. And because of that, he didn't stop and get any water or anything like that. It was a really hot day, and he ended up finishing it. He was an absolute state at the end, because the plan had gone out the window. he'd started off with food and drink. He was going to stop, and it was a hot day, so he was going to stop and get more drinks. But that all went out the window because he had in his head, right, I've got to put my head down and go and sort of try and get a good time. I mean, you could argue that wasn't a very clever thing to do on something that's kind of, it's not a race. It's not like he's going to be up there and winning after having all these problems anyway. But I guess that's a similar situation if you crash in a race, you've chased back for half an hour or something, you've missed that opportunity maybe to take on food and drink, and expended a lot of extra energy that you wouldn't have done in normal situations. So is that something the guys manage on the fly quite well, or?
Yeah, it's always like a very tricky, and it's kind of difficult so those guys are really strong, and they can actually like go very deep. It can really probably they can usually survive the day, but the problem then can be the next day and how to get ready for the next day, because if the next day is a hard stage, they can actually be paying on that day. And like looking at the dynamics over the weekend, like Saturday and Sunday, we were able to see like on Saturday it was like all out, and on Sunday the pace was pretty easy for most of the guys, just because probably they were all like super fatigued, and this would then happen to that particular rider, and you would just be hoping for trying to recover and rescue what can be rescued. And I think we saw this bit with Simon Yates. He's now trying to get the stages rather than the GC because it's been lost on a one bad day. And those guys are then trying to rescue those races. Like in Bora, it's Wilco Kelderman, a similar example. Due to mechanical, he was just he lost a lot of time. And there are probably other guys as well. And at one point you have to decide, is it worth chasing and putting everything out, and then barely surviving for the next few days because of so much fatigue, or just you go easy and then say it and say it call it a day and say, I'm not going for GC, I'm just going for stages.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, they said about Simon Yates maybe having a knee issue, but it seems he's either recovered from that really well from the way he's going, or it was maybe more likely something else if he's bounced back so well, and the other day he was so strong to win that stage, wasn't it? So I guess you get a lot of these unexplained bad days, and we never really know what the cause of that is. But yeah, it could be something as simple as puncturing at the wrong time, and that then affecting their nutrition for that stage. And yes, they get through that fine and no one really notices, but in the day or further days coming along that, they're not able to recover so well.
A big role in Giro now, the heat was played a really big part. And if we take a look back for a couple of years back, it was usually cold, and it was actually I remember the stages on I think it was Gavia, which was covered in snow, so they had to change the route because there was still snow in the mountains, and it was super cold. I think yesterday Giulio Ciccione won, and I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was he won this was the last time he won the stage. And it was the race over the Mortirolo, and it was raining. It was super, super cold. He was shivering down the descent, and I was watching this, and I said, man, well, this is really tough. And this year, completely the opposite. It's super hot, and I think teams were not really prepared for the heat this year, because nobody really expected it to be hot. So when the heat came, they were unprepared, and it's very difficult if you kind of hit the hot stages unprepared. Suddenly riders are asking for more water. There is never enough water. You don't know what to do the nutrition wise, because even the guys can't tell themselves what they want. They just want something, and it's super difficult. And these kind of things that those teams need to deal with. And one day you don't get a bottle, and as soon as like you feel thirsty on a climb, you can basically drop the connection with the main GC guys, and chasing from the behind. It's not just tough work from like a physiological perspective, but also psychological, because they're in front and they're just gaining time and you're losing it, and it's super hard for you. And once you get that bottle, it's never enough, because basically the sweat rates can be like 1.5, 2 liters per hour, and you're only getting like one bottle per hour. So it's kind of thing can go wrong like in one single day. And there are some riders that are really like much better in the heat, even without like proper acclimation than others. And this kind of makes cycling and the sport really interesting, because you never can expect anything. And this is like the last whole week I was concerned and looking at the weather forecast, and the soul is like 28, 30, 32, and I was like, damn it, it's gonna be tough for the riders.
Yeah, and it was a big change. I think the first week was pretty, well, not cool, but it was maybe low 20s, wasn't it? And then it suddenly shot up to mid 30s. So do you change the strategy of how they're getting there? Obviously they need more liquid from the higher sweat rates, but do you change how they're getting their carbs in, their calories in as well, whilst they're taking on more fluid?
So it's a really tricky, because one of the things that, like, physiologically speaking, when you count the heat unprepared, your carbohydrate oxidation rate just shoot up, and you basically deplete glycogen much quicker, so you become fatigued much quicker. But also because of the heat, the blood is redistributed from the intestines towards the muscle and the skin. And this means that the absorption of carbohydrates is much worse. And basically you can't utilize as many carbohydrates that you could on a normal day. And you're basically, you have a big problem. And how to deal with that, it's kind of, I think, very individual. Some tolerate well the liquid-based carbohydrates, meaning like drinks, and some really want or crave water. So in my personal view, like when I ride in the summer, I always have water bottles, and then I have gels. So this way I can like have as many bottles as I need to have, like based on the thirst. And it's much easier to also like calculate it in my head. So, well, I had 1 gel, 2 gels, 3 gels, and this is like X grams of carbs. Mm-hmm. Whereas with drop bottles, like those guys have like, when you see like a Swanee or someone handing out bottles, you just throw the old bottle away and grab a new one. You don't like remember how much there was left, and it's much easier to like go with gels. I'm not saying that this is how we do it, because I think this is like my personal thing. But yeah, this is somehow something I really like, and it works well for me. And it's very individual, I think.
I guess in a way with water in the bottles as well, you don't quite know if you're getting the hydration from that either, because dump it over your head. They've taken a bottle, or maybe they've drunk half of it and dumped the rest over their head to cool down. So the calculations are never going to be perfect in that way. So it's the rider's perception as well. And I mean, I guess it's easy to make mistakes. Do you monitor their actual intake as well as what their planned intake during the stage, and their recovery after the stage as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of important to like keep an eye on that. I personally always think about what's going to happen in the next stage, and kind of, well, you've done what you have done. We can't change the past. So I ask them what they have, but I don't really like pay too much attention. I just say, well, you did a good job, or like next time you really make sure that you have more or something like that. But I don't like take too much into consideration what they had. So we can just learn from what the mistakes we did and improve in the future. but I'm always concerned about the upcoming stage. So yeah, this way can kind of work on, and also like even for the gel, you're never sure that you take every like droplet gram of carbs out of it, and you always like it is always like some probability of an error in estimations, and some riders are like know exactly what they had, and some riders are like, well, I think I had X amount of bottles, and they just lose track sometimes.
Yeah, it's hard to remember in the thick of racing. Maybe on a boring day when you're doing 5 hours at 110 heart rate, it's easier to remember. But if you're in the thick of things and you're attacking and you're racing or you're suffering, it's not the first thing on your mind, is it? How you've taken. I mean, you mentioned earlier putting on weight during a Grand Tour as well. You say planning for the days in advance, and naturally I think, well, yeah, obviously you're not just fueling for one day, you're fueling to recover your glycogen stores for the next day as well. But does that does the fact that you can put on weight, and obviously you got massive mountain stages, I think it's like 5,000 meters climbing in the stage tomorrow, also that's part of what you're planning for as well. You know, are you consciously maybe restricting things a little bit on those long flat stages where you don't think it's going to be as difficult?
Yeah, there is like a lot of risk. Like this concept of fuel for the work required, it was I think first used by Team Ineos in the past, and Team Sky first, and then Team Ineos later on, and I think like pioneered by James Morton, professor from Liverpool John Moores University. And I really like this approach, but it can go very wrong, and they actually say and admit that it got wrong for them as well. And sometimes you see like they really struggle. Like for instance, one day like Chris Froome or whichever rider it is, that couldn't do it and couldn't deliver, and the next day he was just fine. And somehow like, for instance, people would say like start with doping allegations, or this reminds us of like Lance Armstrong or whoever, but it could just be that they were like playing a bit too much with carbohydrates. And it's kind of very easy on the paper to say, well, you need this amount of carbohydrates because this is how much you will need. But glycogen stores are so dynamic, and you can't really expect them to like operate or behave in the way that you kind of predict. Because even like when you deal and do studies, you always have a big sample size just because you have so much variability and daily variation. And this actually happens then in the race. For instance, one day the glycogen repletion is just bad, even though you kind of eat loads of carbohydrates. So it's kind of very, very difficult and to predict those things, and it can go very wrong. And ideally, you would a bit underfuel those easy stages so that you can basically then fuel very well for the really hard stages. So it's kind of, it's very tricky because it can get very, very wrong very quickly. For instance, like probably also worth mentioning is that like GC guys would probably manipulate the carbohydrate intake a bit more than those guys that are just like helping them, because those guys are probably going basically all out every single day at first parts of the race anyway, and then they just it's work done for them, but they have to be ready for that. Whereas GC guys on easy days, they will just be back on the back and just rest basically.
I guess even the domestiques might be a really easy day in general for those guys as well, but they're going to go back and get bottles and moving up and down, and I don't know, their leader stops for a nature break and they're pacing him back on through the cars as well. So a bit more of a consistent highlight maybe for those guys, but then in the same sense, they can, once they've done their job, they can sit up in the last 10 or 20k maybe and start recovering early as well. I guess from going back to the not knowing how well those glycogen stores are recovering, you can get a bit of an idea from just simply weighing people day to day. But yeah, you don't know where those weight changes are coming from with hydration, or I guess you control pretty well what they've eaten outside of the race as well in the meals at that level, because you've got your own chefs and you know exactly what's at the dinner table, etc. But yeah, there's still a lot of unknown in there as well.
Yeah, like body mass can be like a really good indicator what's happening, because if it's low, then it either means its glycogen is low or they are dehydrated. So you know in the morning what you have to do if the body mass is low. Drink well and eat well, and then during the stage as well, really make sure that they're getting enough fuel, because you're basically limiting the damage that the previous stage apparently caused. But sometimes, like I've seen it in the past, cyclists gaining body mass because of stress, and it's very like common, especially in women, that they kind of start to gain weight because they are under fueling and cortisol levels go up, and then because of that and some other hormones as well, they start to accumulate water, and it's not actually body mass. Like body fat increase, and it's kind of very difficult to say, well, to the rider that is gaining body mass, and they say, well, you need to eat more, and he will say like, I'm heavier.
Counterintuitive, yeah.
But and also like it's kind of difficult. Like even when I work with athletes, and they're doing stage races, and then in the morning of an X day, they say, well, my body mass is like, I don't know, 2 kilos up, and I've not expended a lot of energy during the stage because it was easy. And then you say, well, you need to eat a lot because the next stage is super hard, and they say, well, I was heavy this morning, I'm not gonna eat, and I haven't expended a lot of energy, so I'll just put on weight. But the next day is like 5,000 meters of climbing, and well, you need to eat, or you will just really struggle to come over the mountains. And this is very difficult for the nutritionist to kind of explain, and also for the riders to actually understand, because even I, as a nutritionist, I'm always concerned that they will be too heavy, and they will come back to me and say, well, we lost the race because the guy was like, from the start of the race to the end of 3 weeks, he was like, he gained 4 kilos, and this is what was the reason why he didn't win the race.
Stage, yeah. I remember doing a stage race over in Ireland a long time ago again now. But there was one of our teammates, and it was obvious really that he wasn't eating enough for the first couple of days at least, and then eventually he kind of did get his act together and start eating more. But the damage done on those first couple of days of not having eaten enough, he paid the price. And I think he, out of an 8-day race, I think he did maybe 5 days, and then he had to retire. And obviously there's lots of factors involved in that, but I'm personally sort of pretty convinced that seeing him nowhere near eat enough, not necessarily on the bike because you're not riding next to him all the time, but certainly at breakfast and dinner when you're shoveling down the carbs, because obviously he wasn't eating enough, and he paid for that down the line. And you know, that's in relatively shorter stages and not as hard racing as pro racing, so it's going to be even more magnified for that. In terms of sort of looking at recovery day to day as well, so in like in the UK at the moment, there's a series of races called the Tour Series on, and they're evening criteriums. So you might be racing at 8 o'clock at night, you're doing an hour plus an hour and 10 minutes, say, racing, and you typically take a lot of caffeine before that as well. And the thing with these races are they're quite, I think this year it's only 7 races over a 3-week period, but in the past it's been 10 races over 3 weeks. So you're racing 3 times a week, and obviously you're finishing late at night, you've had a lot of caffeine, and then you're not able to sleep until sort of 2 a.m, and you might have to race again the next day, or if not, 2 days later. In something like a stage race, a Giro, say, you haven't even got that day to sleep in the next day. You've got to get up and race the next day. Is that something that you think impacts on recovery, and do you plan anything around that?
Yeah, those it's very common. Yeah, sometimes in the mainland Europe, you have a criterium in the evening, and then the next day you have just 1 day race, starting at early afternoon or just midday. And obviously for glycogen replenishment, you need the time available. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen. And it's kind of really difficult because obviously 1 hour of hard racing all out basically eats all the glycogen stores. When we did glycogen depletion sessions, there are some guys like you that lasted for a couple of hours, 3 hours. But some people just last for an hour and they're basically pretty much depleted of glycogen. And thinking about glycogen, you need at least 16 hours probably to kind of replete the levels to what they were before the start. And if you think about in the evening, you finish 8 o'clock and you can't eat loads then. And the first 4 hours are probably the most important when it comes to replenishing of glycogen. So it's very tricky what to do in this scenario. And you mentioned caffeine as well. So obviously ergogenic aid such as caffeine can be very helpful in those scenarios, but I would really think twice whether I would use the caffeine or not. And probably I would say no, it's not worth it, because definitely you want to sleep. And for the next day, I think it's more important that you kind of have you're well rested. And yeah, because even if you fall asleep at midnight and they say, well, yeah, next day the start is only at noon, I can sleep. Then if you don't wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning and you don't start eating, and you only have breakfast a couple of hours before the start, and you try to eat loads, it's just not gonna work. So it's very, very difficult how to deal with those situations. And it's very individual, I think. And it's also really making sure that you get the carbohydrates in the simplest possible form after the stage, that you don't eat pasta with lots of fat, because this will just slow down the absorption. You have to think whether protein is as important as a carbohydrate, so to really put all the resources into what is the most important to recover. And I think that these are carbohydrates. And then perhaps even in the morning you wake up, have something to eat, and then you go back to bed and try to sleep 1-2 hours more, and then wake again and then eat again. And it's probably better to have caffeine than in the morning to wake you up for that race, rather than struggle sleeping because of all the excitement or because of the race.
Yeah, I mean, you struggle to convince people to maybe not take caffeine before an evening race, because it's just such a big part of racing for most people, whether that's just a little coffee or a caffeine supplement in the hour before the race. I mean, certainly from my experience doing those evening races, I mean, at the moment I probably wouldn't bother taking caffeine for an evening race, because I value my sleep a little bit more. But if it was a really important race, then you would do it and take the hit of the fact that you're not going to get to sleep until 2 a.m. and try and deal with that. But yeah, I guess in something like in a stage race like the Giro, maybe it's a case of I mean, people would often take it in the last day of a race as well, wouldn't they, to to give that final boost, but you're finishing early enough then to deal with that afterwards.
There is like with caffeine, there is another aspect when it comes to like stage races. I think it's also important because you always like, you're not racing just on the day, you also need to think about recovery, and caffeine just doesn't give you more energy. It just basically enables you to push harder, and by pushing harder, you're going deeper into those red numbers, and you dig a bigger hole. Basically, you damage your muscles to a bigger degree, and this just means that the recovery after such a session will be longer. So if you take caffeine day after day, at some point you might actually cause the recovery not to be sufficient anymore, and you might struggle. On the top, if you add like heat on the top of that, because we know that in the heat muscle damage is even higher, and combine this with the caffeine, then you can basically get a disaster. So one day, like one stage, this can rescue you, but if you do it like over and over again, sooner or later this will be just too much, and you will just not recover as well. So you really have to think what's coming the next day. You have the time to recover. If it's an easy stage the next day, and this is like really important one, take the caffeine. But if tomorrow or the next day is like again really hard day, then perhaps like lose that 1 second, lose that 2 seconds, but be able to like perform the next day as well. So those are kind of really tough decisions for the nutritionist, because it's a lot of responsibility, and for the rider as well. But you have to be kind of confident in what you're doing. And I'm not saying that I'm doing that, but I would actually consider placebos. I think placebo effect can be really important here, in terms of like from the nutritional perspective, and just like perhaps persuading the rider that he got something, which was just a placebo. This is probably unethical, but
I think it's a bit questionable, really, isn't it? Of how, like say, ethical that would be, sort of misleading someone like that. I mean, it's not necessarily dangerous in any way, but don't know how I feel about that myself. But I forgot what I was going to say now.
I mean, it's a really tough one, and I always like struggle, and sometimes I think it's a really good like option to consider, and we know that placebo works. It improves performance, so why not rescue some of the performance that you lose because if you're not actually giving something, and you still kind of try to like do something. But
I guess it's a case of like, if say you lose the GC by 5 seconds at the end of a 3-week tour, was that 5 seconds that you lost in the first week the key, or by holding back a little bit in the first week, whether that's, like you say, sort of not going full gas with the caffeine, or whether it's just riding conservatively, and you see riders, get dropped on a climb, diesel themselves back on, or maybe not quite make it all the way back on and lose 10 seconds in the stage. Have they lost it from losing that 10 seconds, or had they gone deep on that stage, put themselves in the red, would they have lost a minute in the last week? And that's something you can never know, really, is it? It's
that's something you probably, it's good to like think about that, but in the end, like you can come up so many like different like problems, or like what you did wrong. Even like one bottle, like had we have a Swanee on the side of the road giving that one additional bottle, and the rider wouldn't have felt thirsty, for instance, would he be able to like win the race? That's kind of super like
what ifs.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about having Swanees set at various points over the race, So I saw one of your posts on social media recently, which I think was from an amateur rider of a feeding strategy for a mountainous Grand Fondo, was it? And that was obviously, and she, I believe, was sort of taking gels at the top of every climb, and I think you said that she had a team support, even though it was an amateur race, providing those gels there. So how, going back a level or several to those amateur riders, normally you've not got that level of support in a race or in a Grand Fondo. How would you manage that? Really, it's like you can't rely on having that brand of sports drink that you normally have at the feed zones. Do you take everything you possibly can in the pockets and maybe just go with taking water at the feed zones, or try and get used to that van that is available before the event?
Yeah, so my personal, like, I've done a few Grand Fondos and I will do like a couple of more hopefully this year. And I obviously plan the strategies for many riders throughout the year. It's kind of very tricky. And sometimes I feel like with a lot of thought, you can actually do it better than the professional riders are doing it. Because even just the pace, you know pretty much exactly how things will go, because those amateur races, they're always like pretty much all out from the start. There is no like, it's not the same as in professional cycling when they're calculating and then you just like launch a sprint towards the end, or just launch an attack towards the end. Everything is like, more calculated here, and you can expect it's gonna go hard from the start. At least like you can't expect for the first part of this like Grand Fondo to be easy, so it's gonna be pretty hard from the start. And one of the things that I always do is like take a look at what who the sponsor is and what does the organization is going to supply. And most of the time, I find the products to be like very bad quality. So it's
overly diluted as well for the drinks.
Or you get like bakery stuff on the sweet zones. Well, for any high performance athlete, it's obviously a no-go, or like fruits and stuff. It's fine for fun. If you're going just like to have fun on the bike, if you have fun day on the bike, but it's definitely not good for like somebody that wants to like win the race. So what you then do is like, well, how can I sufficiently prepare myself so that I'm independent of those feeding stations? So one option is obviously have friends on the side of the road, and this can work, but you need really good friends that they stand there for the whole day and wait for you for that 1 second when they pass you the bottle, and then you probably yell at them, just saying,
well, one bottle as well.
Or something that, why you're standing here, not like 100 meters above, or something like that, because you're annoyed and you're tired and you're very grumpy. But I was doing the race last year. It was like Sportful Dolomiti. I planned everything very nicely. I had gels, the 45 grams. They were still in prototype version at the time. I didn't have like the gels. I put the gels into the flasks, they're plastic flasks for hydration usually. But I put the gels in so that
so you could several gels in one safe space.
Yeah, and I had 2 flasks with like, I think the race was like around 6 or 7 hours, can't remember. And I would plan for like 90 grams per hour, and I had those 2 flasks in my back pocket. I started with like 750 milliliters water bottles. It was a super hot day, and my plan was to basically stop to get the water from the feeding stations, because that's always available there. So basically that's what I did. The problem obviously was that like the other people were having like people around on the road, at least in the level I was competing. So I was really struggling because you never know how much time you will need to get to the next feeding station, and then you lose the time for getting the water into the bidons, and you're just like, you're very annoyed and just takes you out of the rhythm, and it's very hard. But I think that's the best strategy to be prepared. And I remember like doing a few years ago, Grand Fondo Stelvio Centini, I finished third. My jersey at the start of the race had 1,300 grams because I had all those gels I was carrying all those gels with me. But basically, it worked. I was looking funny opening the first gel like after 15 minutes of racing. But basically, that was my strategy, and I stick to that strategy, and it was actually working. And in speaking of the timing, you have to kind of, based on the weather, you decide how you're going to take the combination of gels and the drinks. And in this particular case, it was like, I think the top of the climb is the most important time to like take the fuel rather than during the climb, because when you're working hard, the blood is going into the muscles, into the skin, and not into the intestines. So you're not like absorbing huge amount of carbohydrates in those times. Whereas on the descent, it's very easy to absorb the carbohydrates, to digest them, and also like in very hot weather, people, and including myself, like hate that sweet taste in the mouth. But it's more manageable on the descent. So if you take the gel on the top, it's sweet, and then you start the next climb, the gel starts being absorbed probably by that time, and you have that energy boost at the bottom of the climb as well, and you just drink water, for instance, or during the climb you drink an isotonic drink, or any kind of drink you have, so to meet your like energy kind of goals. So in that case, like I was recommending the gels on the top of the climbs, but this girl was drinking also the drink with carbohydrates. So if I was doing it myself, I would probably have a gel on the top of the climb and on the bottom of the climb, and then just drink water during, also depending on the time, on how long the climb is. But I'm a fan of drinking water. Some don't really like it, and some believe, well, where are you getting the electrolytes? Well, our gels have electrolytes, and that's part of the reasoning why I put the electrolytes into the gels, because you can combine them with water. Then you have a choice. And there are many gels out on the market without electrolytes. And then I hear, well, you need electrolytes. Yeah, well, choose different gels, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's different, aren't they? I personally like getting, when it's going hard, I would just like to have a drink with carbs in, and then during the easier parts of the race, then get the solid food or the gels down then, which I guess coincides with what you say, like having it at the top of the climbs. I think I'd naturally have it over the top or on the descent to, so that the harder digestive work of having solid food or gels is done when you freewheeling mostly down the hills or during the part of the race where it's not so full gas.
It's also like it really depends on the weather. For like last year I did two completely the opposite races in terms of the weather. One was like in the rain, in the mountains. It was cold. I was shivering on the descents, and basically for the whole 4 hours, I think I drank like a bottle and a half. And obviously in both bottles, I think I had carbohydrates, but I was like combining those carbohydrates with gels because simply I was not drinking that much fluid. On the other hand, on the other race, I was just like trying to drink as much as possible of water and then have gels, because that's why I was able to kind of take control of how much I have. And it's kind of, you need to adapt and see what works for certain environmental conditions. Because if you rely just on the drink, for instance, like just a stupid example, but if you say, well, I'm going to start with 2 bottles of carbohydrates and I will go with, for instance, Endurance 90 drink, because this will give me the most carbohydrates. And I will have 2 bottles of this, and it's super hot and you're thirsty. And then you drink in the first hour, you drink both of those bottles. This is just not gonna end up well, having 180 grams of carbs in the first hour. So
in your stomach digesting.
Yeah.
Sure. It's interesting you say about, I mean, we've talked about a lot about getting enough in the heat, but also in the cold. Sometimes it's hard to open packets with your fingers, isn't it? You know, it's one of those where it's actually easy to not take on enough as well, just because you're freezing cold, you can't open things, and you're not drinking as much, so you're not getting the liquid calories in as well. It's really another important scenario to plan.
Yeah, it's very individual, all those things, because it's kind of, because I'm a cyclist myself, and part of the reason I'm really trying hard to like cycle, and part of the motivation I do this is to actually be able to experience what the riders are going through. So when I speak to the rider, he tells me the problem he has, and I say, well, do I have a similar experience, and then how would I do it in a similar situation? And then I usually kind of understand, because on the paper, like we all know 90 grams per hour of carbohydrates for this and this duration, but sometimes you have to like adapt and think about it in a different way, about the timing, not have it in like the hardest part of the race, but come up with a different solution, and trying different things out on your own. I think this is like a really good experience, and even like different products that are on the market, different types of gels. If you decide to rely on the feed zones, it's worth like just buying or purchasing those products that they're going to offer there, so that you know what you can expect.
Get on well with them,
yeah. So all those things can work very well, and
So I mean, second thing we wanted to talk about today was how obviously the Giro and World Tour racing is very top of the tree, but for pro team, you might do races that don't quite have the same prestige as Giro. You've not got as many staff members, or I was working on a race in China for a continental team, and even though it was a 2.HC category race, so it could have had a lot of World Tour teams in it, because it was in China. It's a little bit out of the way. There wasn't any World Tour teams in there. It was made up with lower budget teams, obviously less funding, less staff, etc. It's still like a really hard race. It was a 2-week race, a lot of time up at altitudes and long climbs. I think it went up to like, I want to say 4,000 meters was the highest altitude. It went really, really high, because a lot of it was on a plateau that was, you started off at 2,000 meters, and only went up from there. So on those kind of races where you're more reliant on what the race organisation's providing for you, maybe because you can't realistically ship as much stuff across the world to China as you could if you were driving your bus from service course in Belgium to the race in Italy, for example, and you're reliant on the hotel and the food that they provide, which kind of, in my experience of racing from amateur to pro level, relatively low levels, is basically sort of overcooked chicken and overcooked pasta in a lot of cases, with lots of baguettes if you're in France. How would you kind of suggest a team in that situation makes the most of not an ideal situation, really?
Yeah, so the most important thing is always like, it comes to like that, getting the energy in. I think like in a week or like even 2 weeks, I think nobody will like suffer of not having like enough vegetables or enough fruits, if that's not possible, but they will definitely suffer if they don't get enough energy in. So you have to make sure that the riders eat those carbohydrates. And how to achieve that if the food is overcooked? Well, I like to say that it's there is always a solution in Haribos, because there is such a big variety of them that you'll probably find some that work for the riders. You just need to like kind of find them. And I really like to say that like even to like any riders, even like racing at home, for instance, for glycogen loading, you have some normal food, but then the rest you fill up with like very sugary things, and this way kind of you get the energy in very quickly to be digested. You don't risk like overeating something you really don't hate or don't like, and this way you can probably like find the best solution. And also like finding in the shops or groceries some protein stuff, and you can always kind of find a solution to these problems. And I remember like when I was in a training camp actually with you in Spain. We were in a hotel. It wasn't really bad. The food wasn't bad. It was actually okay. It was tasty and anything, but I was really like concerned about the fats. And yeah, every day I went to go and buy some Haribos, and I was eating Haribos. And then the dinner I was just like, well, yeah, if this feels too fatty, and I will just eat a bit of this so that I kind of enjoy the food. But I was getting the carbohydrates from other sources. And this is kind of, the ideal scenario. And I know that like some people hate Haribos, don't like the taste, but
brands are available, I should say.
It's probably because they're just not having the ones that they like. That's why they have such a big variety at Haribo. And I know the UK selection is very bad. I agree. I never buy Haribos in the UK, but when I go to like Slovenia and Austria or Germany, I always find some that are really, really good, and I just can't stop eating them. So I think the Haribo is a solution for those scenarios. And you're not missing on anything, in my personal view. And sometimes like professional riders can actually be struggling to get the required amount of food with normal food in, with pasta, like some vegetables and stuff. So it's actually, you can actually do much better job like by eating Haribo. So yeah, Haribo all the way.
The simple way to do it, especially like you've got a 4-hour transfer between end of a stage and going to the start of the next one. It's like, right, sit there, eat was it 200 gram bag of Haribo? Is it a big one, something like that?
Yeah, it says share size, but who's gonna share Haribos?
Tim does not share Haribos.
No. Don't dare to ask.
And I guess, even if Haribos aren't available, there's always an equivalent around somewhere.
Yeah, there is always, I mean, there are some other options as well, obviously, that can be as good as like Haribos. Like you can have something liquid-based carbohydrates, just like drinking Coke, Fanta, or something like that. I know it's not the best thing in the world, but you're still getting those carbohydrates in, and this works very well.
Everyone loves a nice cold can of Coke at the end of a race, don't they? It's universal, I think, almost.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess so. That's the outside of the race scenario. Inside a race like that, whereas, I mean, how many staff would you guys have at the Giro, for example, at the moment, sort of with soigneurs and mechanics and everything?
Yeah, I can't really say the number because I haven't checked. But like, imagine we have a kitchen truck, we have a bus, we have a mechanics truck, so we have like 3 big vehicles. Then it's also like this director sportifs cars. It's cars for soigneurs. So it's a big team of people, and the drivers and doctor, the chef. I think probably we have 3 or 4 mechanics on pretty much each race. We have probably like 3, 4, or 5 soigneurs, because some stay in the hotel, just move stuff around like the bags and stuff, and then some go to the races to hand out bottles. take care of the riders before and after the race. So it's like a big team of people actually. We can talk about probably like if you have like 8 or 9 riders, we talk about at least 2 times as much stuff. Sometimes even 3 times probably if you're talking like team Ineos or something like that. So it's a big team of people. They're just for like cycling.
Yeah. So in the situation where, say in China, I think we had 5 members of staff there. We still had 2 cars in the race, similar as you would do in the Giro. Say, I keep going back to that, but that's what's on at the moment. But then we don't. So all the staffs are in those 2 cars. You don't have any scope for then sending someone ahead to a feed zone or going on a climb to hand up bottles, have spare wheels if there was a bad road section or something, for example. So you kind of at a disadvantage there already because you're limited to feeding from the car really. And if you've got riders in several groups, if someone's got dropped and you've got to stay with the group in front, for example, you go past that rider, give him a couple of bottles and a pocket full of food, and then he's on his own then for the rest of the day really. So you're always going to be at a bit of a disadvantage compared to either a bigger team at that race that maybe can afford to send 7, 8, 10 staff for it, for example. But do you think that sort of, is there anything you would try and plan around that situation to try and mitigate those disadvantages somehow?
In terms of like the fueling, if the riders then rely on gels on like something that pre-packaged food, like say, and not the drinks, I think this kind of makes sense to like have a bit more in your back pockets, and because you can always like probably get some water from organizers, some like medics or any other like car, whereas you will be really struggling if you don't have like the carbohydrates around with you. So this will be like, probably the best thing to think about, to fill up the pockets with more carbohydrate, more carbs. Other than that, it's kind of really difficult to like say, and I think those big teams really have a big advantage from that perspective. Because I remember like I was like really concerned sometimes when he couldn't like hand out the bottle, and he starts thinking, well, they don't have a bottle at the bottom of the climb, they throw away the bottle because to be lighter, and then on the top they think, we'll get one, but they don't. So what's then happening for the next one? And the team has more like those stations, feeding stations, that they just like are in a way better position. So it's kind of, that's part of the racing, and why bigger teams are more successful, I guess.
Going back a few years, that sort of epic solo break by Chris Froome, one of the things you really noticed there was he was getting a bottle kind of, it seemed like every 20-30 minutes, and not all teams have got 30 staff that they can spread out across a 200-kilometer stage to hand out bottles for a planned attack like that. So it's something like that might only really be possible, obviously, for a guy who's at the top of his game, but also if they know that, yes, there's going to be this support around, that I can get what I need throughout the stage as well.
Yeah, that stage was definitely crazy, and I keep coming back. So basically we're talking about the stage at the Giro d'Italia 2018, I think. 2018, 2018, and that was just epic, and I keep coming back and learning from that stage because it was really epic, and in terms of like how the nutrition was planned, because the data was actually published then later on. You can find it on the internet. But the amount of carbohydrates and stuff he was getting, it was just enormous. I think like on the day, the feeding was not perfect. Like looking back, I would change a few things. The products he was using were not ideal. The carbohydrate ratio was not ideal. But there is still like very interesting to see how many people they had there. And the idea was basically get a bottle like every 20 minutes take a few sips and then throw it away, be as light as possible, rather than carry like 1 liter of water around all the time. And this is kind of, these are the marginal gains pretty much. I'm pretty sure he would have won that stage even without all those people around him. Perhaps not for like that much time, but those are the marginal gains basically.
How to fuel a 120 kilometer time trial or whatever for the play for us. Oh, cool. Right. We've been talking for a while now, so I think maybe that's time to cut things off for this time. I think we're going to sort of try and continue on a bit of a similar subject next time, but take it again down a level a little bit and look at how you would fuel at a more amateur level when you haven't got that support. We've touched upon that today, and most people would never do a stage race, so we'll talk about how your average rider might want to fuel something that's the equivalent of their stage race, like going on a training camp or doing a multiple day sportive, for example.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And always feel free to drop us the questions to the website, the YouTube channel, wherever, and we'll try to answer them next time around.
Great point. Cool. Thanks a lot, Tim, and I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Cheers, you too.